Chapter 4, Second Year, 2369 to 2370. This looks like shunt, Nevrio said, blinking at the low brown hills that ran to the horizon under a blinding white sun. What's that? Bobby Ray asked. Shunt is a Bajoran resettlement camp where I grew up. As a last-year cadet, Nevrio had waited as long as he could before taking the required survival test. His two teammates, Bobby Ray and Starsa, were second-year cadets and had chosen to take the test as soon as they could. He knew the only reason they had agreed to have him on their team was because there was a certain sense of obligation that came from being in their first quad together. There were lots of other cadets who would have liked to team with Starsa and Bobby Ray. They were both athletes, Bobby Ray because of his admirable physique and Starsa in spite of hers. It had taken Starsa nearly a year to acclimate, but now she seemed to be making up for lost time. Rio had watched her the entire summer, and she hadn't seemed to mind being stuck on Earth for her vacation break. From his workstation assisting at the Academy database, he could see a bunch of cadets who grav-boarded on the concourse. Of all the crazy cadets who were left on the campus, it was Starsa who made him swallow in fear. The way she hung off the front edge, riding that fine line between the fastest speed the human body could achieve and out-of-control tumbling, made him dig his fingers into his own thighs until blue bruises rose to the surface. Dear me. Rio hadn't dared to ask Bobby Ray and Starsa if he could join their team. It had been their decision to include him. When he had first found out, he gave thanks to the prophets, in spite of his crises of faith. At least he had a chance to survive, let alone pass the test. Rio had prepared for the test by taking extra survival courses every semester. Now they were standing on a ridge, overlooking a barren, rocky desert of sharp cliffs and flat-top plateaus, very much like the only place he really did know. Shunt, he repeated, shaking his head. You say that like it's bad, Bobby Ray pointed out. He was looking very uncomfortable in his rubber suit. Where's all the water? Down the cracks? If this is like shunt, we'll have trouble finding enough water to stay alive. Bobby Ray undid the neck bundle of his waterproof suit. Everyone said there would be water. The last 8 times survival missions took place in a marsh, a bog, 2 swamps, and 4 rain jungles. Rio shrugged, just as boggled as Bobby Ray was over this unusual twist. Bobby Ray let out a frustrated growl as he peeled the rubber suit off his fur. He had been so smugly satisfied as the cadet ship had beamed them down to the surface, so certain that he wouldn't have to suffer 4 days of wet fur, that his disgruntlement at finding themselves high and dry was ironic, to say the least. Where's Starsa? Rio asked, glancing around. Bobby Ray tossed the rubber aside. I didn't see anything till you came over that ridge. I was put down a few meters inside that ravine, Rio said. Bobby Ray judged the angles and decided, I bet she's over there. If not, we'll be on higher ground and able to see better. What if we don't find her? Rio asked. We'll find her. Bobby Ray started toward the rise about 100 meters away from them. You've got room for that, don't you? Sure. Nevrio paused long enough to gather up the rubber suit and stuff it in his bag before hurrying after the wrecks. From their vantage point on top of the slight rise, Rio could see that, like shunt, this plateau desert was a step-by-step series of fairly flat-topped units separated from each other by cliffs and broken steep-sided slopes. One glance revealed it to be a vast and lonely land with no signs of life other than a few brown, scraggly plants on the edges of the plateaus or down in the narrow canyons. Bobby Ray planted his feet firmly, looking around for Starsa and bellowing her name. Starsa! They could hear his voice echo against flat-sided canyons for what seemed like miles. In an aside to Rio, he added, "This is the ugliest place I've ever seen." Rio swallowed. "I sort of like the colors." The layers of rock exposed by the canyons were brilliantly varied in hues of purple, red-orange, yellow-gray, and creamy beige. Maybe that explained his innate desire to study geology. Rocks, he knew. It could be a color chart lesson in planet building. Bobby Ray gave him a look. "It's useless land, all chopped up." Rio gave up trying to explain exogeology to the Rex. "Where's Starsa?" "How should I know?" Bobby Ray retorted, looking annoyed. "What will we do if we can't find her?" "We'll find her." "How?" Rio asked. "Stop asking so many questions." Bobby Ray kept gazing around as if hoping Starsa would pop up from one of the canyons. Nev Rio obediently kept his mouth shut. The only thing that made him feel better was knowing that his vital signs and location were being closely monitored by the cadet ship. The 4 dozen cadets participating in the survival test had placed the temporary orbital satellites in the stratosphere of the planet themselves. If anything serious went wrong with the cadet, a transporter would pluck them from the surface before serious injury could occur. There were a number of stories at the academy, like the one of a cadet losing her grip at the top of a cypress tree and falling 30 meters before dematerializing in front of the shocked eyes of her survival team. Of course, that cadet had failed the test, but all Rio cared about was that she had lived to tell about it. Rio opened his mouth, but remembered in time that Bobby Ray didn't like questions. He quietly followed the orange Rex as they tried to triangulate their arrival positions. Ideally, a survival team rejoined shortly after transporting to their test site, and then rejoined with as many other cadet teams as possible while managing to stay alive. By nightfall, Nev Rio and Bobby Ray hadn't found a single cadet, including Starsa. Rio ventured to ask, "We'll fail if we don't find her, won't we?" "Yes," Bobby Ray said shortly, as irritable as if Rio had personally caused Starsa's disappearance. They settled in for the night under an overhang of sandstone, where the shale at the base of the cliff had been cut away by the wind. There was a nice pile of sand that had been deposited by the last rush of water that had run through the canyon. But from the lack of growth, Rio estimated that had been seasons ago. "I hope Starsa is all right," Rio worried as they smoothed the sand into a place to sleep. "She's fine. She's just down in one of these pits like us," Bobby Ray grumbled. They hadn't been able to build a fire because of the lack of suitable vegetation, but the absence of any sort of print or trail in the sand had led them to believe it would be safe to sleep on the ground. Actually, they had no choice. It was either here or up on one of the plateaus exposed to the rising wind. At least in the canyon, they had a semblance of shelter. Bobby Ray yawned, obviously feeling better now that they weren't tramping uselessly all over the place. "Besides, as long as we find another team, then we can still get a qualified pass." "But Starsa's part of our team," Rio protested. "We have to find her." Bobby Ray shrugged, no longer assuring Rio that they would find her. Rio didn't say anything, but he didn't like it that Bobby Ray was giving up on her. He worried about Starsa almost as much as he envied her innocence of certain tensions and her lack of fear or self-doubt. She lived completely in the moment, unrestrained, yet unaware of her own freedom. But that made her vulnerable in ways the other cadets couldn't imagine. Rio slept uneasily that night, and at one point he felt Bobby Ray get up and squirm into his rubber suit for warmth and protection against the wind. Without any cloud cover, the heat was released from the atmosphere and the rock walls lost their warmth almost as soon as the sun went down. Soon after, Bobby Ray passed out so solidly that even when Rio moved in closer, trying to get out of the wind behind the bulk of the Rex's body, Bobby Ray didn't stir. He kept thinking about Starsa, out there all alone. The next day, they spent circling the area where they had beamed down. They stayed on top of the plateaus except when they had to descend into the canyons to cross to another section. In the morning, Bobby Ray once again seemed confident they would soon find Starsa, but as it turned out, the plateaus were deceptively hilly, hiding variations and crevices in the land until they were nearly upon them. Nev Rio felt completely at home in the arid place. Most of the scant vegetation grew in the eroded crevices leading off the plateaus. A few pygmy trees similar to ostrich conifers. The central portions of the highlands were barren hills formed from ancient layers of volcanic ash that had turned to clay. It was likely that plants couldn't get a hold in the clay because it swelled in the brief wet periods and shrank when dry. Half the morning was gone when they came upon cadets Polar, Reeves, and Ijen. Nev Rio's worst fear was finally confirmed when he saw Polar's contorted, misery-filled face. Rio had suspected something was wrong because of Starsa's disappearance, but Bobby Ray hadn't listened to him. Now, none of the cadets could ignore Polar's anguished breathing and sweaty skin. The other team was halfway down a cliff in an impromptu camp on a narrow ledge. Nev Rio couldn't stop staring at the shreds of Polar's uniform hanging down one side, echoing the torn flesh underneath. He wheezed from the ribs broken in the fall. Through his why is this so poorly edited? Though his chest was now bound with a support bandage from the med kit. Reeves and Ijen looked almost as bad as Polar, having tended their pain-racked teammate all night on their exposed perch. Why hasn't the cadet ship picked him up? Bobby Ray demanded, his voice rising in fear. They were all looking up into the shimmering pearl-gray sky. Didn't you call? Nev Rio asked, nearly panicked at Polar's streaky white pallor. He was already digging into his pocket to grab his own alarm summons. Bobby Ray tried to stop him, but Rio activated it anyway, not caring if they failed their own test. He wanted Polar off these rocks and in sickbay now. They waited, expecting a medical team to appear or to hear a summons on their comm badges keyed to the cadet ship overhead, but nothing happened. And there was no sound but the wind whistling around the rocks. Ijen sat with her head in her hands, obviously too weary to get her hopes up that a different alarm summons would work. Something's happened to the cadet ship, she said dully. What could happen to the cadet ship? Rio blurted out. Reeves obligingly began to supply possibilities. It was attacked. It crashed. The crew died of food poisoning. The life support system failed. What are you saying? Bobby Ray demanded. That we're on our own down here? Ijen slowly raised her head. Yes. Bobby Ray didn't believe it. Starfleet wouldn't desert a bunch of their own cadets. There'd be so many people protesting in the Federation Assembly that the Academy would never recover from the scandal. Even with the evidence right in front of his eyes, he couldn't believe they would all slowly die on this waste planet. Maybe there's something magnetic going on, Bobby Ray told them. Something in the ionosphere. You hear about it all the time. Nevria was nodding in support, still anxiously looking to the sky, as if to expect the cadet ship to suddenly appear overhead. But Reeves shook his head. You helped deploy the satellites. This planet has a very weak magnetic field because it's no longer tectonically active. Well, it's got to be something, Bobby Ray insisted. Excited electrons in the stratosphere or solar flares. We just have to wait for it to subside and they'll come get us. Now both Reeves and Ijen were looking at him, their expressions dull from lack of sleep. If we don't get more water soon, Reeves said, we'll be dead before that happens. We've explored as far as we dare to go alone, and we can't leave Polar. We'll find water, Bobby Ray told them, glad to have a firm objective in mind. Rio hesitated. That might not be so easy. We'll find water, Bobby Ray repeated, looking straight at the former Vedic, willing him to shut up. Sure, the other cadet agreed. Cowed into submission? It was difficult climbing down the rest of the way into the canyon, even for Bobby Ray. He couldn't understand why the other cadets had tried to descend at that point. It was obviously unstable. Perhaps the cadet ship was waiting to see how the other two handled the situation they'd gotten themselves into. But Bobby Ray somehow doubted that. Polar was in real pain. No one in Starfleet could be that callous. Bobby Ray led Rio down into the canyon, heading in the direction that Ijen and Reeves said appeared to lead toward a larger canyon. He and Rio would be needing water soon, too. They had been looking for water all morning, in fact, and Bobby Ray was becoming adept at recognizing the types of terrain that seemed like they should contain water, but in fact didn't. Sometimes you find seeps back in these overhangs, Rio said for perhaps the 10th time. Bobby Ray folded his arms, waiting while Rio crawled forward on his stomach under the sandstone ledge, feeling around cautiously with one hand. The only life forms they had discovered were long, ovoid insects with too many short legs that burrowed into the sand. He shuddered, thinking of where they had slept the night before, but at least he'd had the protection of the waterproof. He knew it would come in handy. There was also a round-bellied rock dweller that had extra long legs and lived in the dark places and the cracks. The Bajoran soon emerged, shaking his hand as if he'd encountered something scurrying inside. Bobby Ray couldn't help twitching his own hands as if invisible insects were crawling across his fur. No water, Rio reported glumly. Bobby Ray started to say, I could have told you, when the sound of rocks falling further up the canyon made him stop. Starsa, Rio exclaimed to Bobby Ray. He called out, Starsa! We're over here! Starsa! Bobby Ray led the way down the canyon, heading further away from the sick camp, as he was beginning to think of it. They went much further than it had sounded, calling out all the way, but they didn't see or hear anything else. Not for the first time, Bobby Ray regretted that their comm badges were only linked to the cadet ship rather than the other cadets. Look at this, Rio suddenly said. Bobby Ray joined him at the base of a loose pile of sedimentary rock. A few had rolled beyond the pile, and nearby there was some sort of mark on the hard-packed rocky soil. 4 parallel grooves dug deeply into the ground. What is it? Rio asked. Bobby Ray glanced around, unsheathing his knife. I don't know. It doesn't seem natural, Rio said hesitantly. Bobby Ray stuck the point of his knife into the groove, and it sank nearly 3 inches. Looks dangerous, whatever it is. Try scratching the surface, Rio suggested. Bobby Ray jabbed at the dirt. He had to dig a few passes to make his ragged groove as deep. When he stood up, he kept his knife out, the only weapon the cadets had been allowed to bring on this test. "It looks dangerous," he repeated. "I figured this was too easy." "Easy? You call this easy? Puller's chest is shattered. We can't find Starsa, and all of us are going to die if we don't find water soon." Nevrio stared at him. "Easy?" Bobby Ray let him blather on, mainly keeping an eye on the surrounding cliffs. He led them out of the narrow chasm as soon as he could, certain that their best tactical situation would be to climb up on the plateaus. Luckily, when they reached the top, they were on a long and winding plateau that was interconnected with several other large islands in the midst of the canyonlands. Nevrio pointed excitedly to a fluff of green vegetation at the bottom of one of the deepest canyons. "There has to be water down there." The sun was at its height, and the day grew hotter as they slowly made their way down into the canyon. But they were rewarded at the bottom, where there was a small seep in the wall. It trickled through a thick green mat of algae before disappearing into the damp sand at the base of the cliff. Bobby Ray shoved his way through tall grass and tiny-leafed bushes that grew protectively around the seep. Filling all 5 canteens took some time, as Rio patiently held each nozzle up to the trickle. Bobby Ray scouted the area, never going much further than a few 100 meters before Rio's worried call drew him back. Bobby Ray was certain he heard footsteps, and twice he turned to see the movement of a shadow. But on this planet, they'd seen nothing capable of moving or casting a shadow. Not a cloud, not a plant, not any animal. As Rio was capping the last canteen, Bobby Ray stood over him, keeping an eye out for his stalker. He was certain he was being stalked. If Titus had come on the survival test, he could have assumed it was him, because that would be typical of the cadet. But Titus and Jamie had passed Academy-approved survival tests the summer before their first year. "I'm finished," Nevrio announced, moving stiffly from having crouched so long next to the seep. Bobby Ray ignored Rio's request to rest, and he rushed the older cadet back to the spot where they had descended into the canyon. Nevrio tried to pull away. "If we follow this canyon, we should meet up with the one below the sick camp." "No, we need to get higher," Bobby Ray insisted. "We're easy targets down here." "It will take extra time to climb to the top," Nevrio said patiently. "Can't we follow the canyon a little ways to where the walls aren't so high?" Bobby Ray wasn't looking forward to scaling the cliffs either, but he wasn't in the mood for arguments. "I'm not leaving our ropes here." "Why not? We'll have to come back again to get more water. We've got 3 more days left of the survival test." Before Bobby Ray could veto his suggestion, the Bajoran added, "And if we can find a way through the bottom of the canyon, we can carry Puller here. That way we won't have to keep taking the water to him." The threat of having to plod back and forth every day between the sick camp and the seep was enough to make Bobby Ray agree. But as they made their way down the canyons, he kept a wary eye out for the stalker. Nevrio kept pointing to rock outcroppings and shimmering heat distortions, asking Bobby Ray what they were. The Rex mostly ignored the Bajoran, focusing outward, refusing to believe that, like Rio, his own paranoia was making him see and hear things. The first warning came almost subliminally, a subtle whine carried with the wind, then a distant wail that rose and sustained, raising the hackles on his neck. Rio's eyes grew round as Bobby Ray tensed, instinctively bracing himself for an attack as the wail ended in a shriek. "What was that?" Rio started to ask. "Shh!" Bobby Ray cut him off with one firm swipe of a paw, just millimeters from his face. Nevrio looked as if he swallowed his own tongue, but he was quiet. Bobby Ray paced around the other cadet in a tight circle, looking upward as another wail began to rise, echoing back and forth against the canyon walls. His tail kept twitching, and his fur told him there was something moving nearby, but they saw nothing. After that, it was easy to convince Rio that they should take to higher ground. The nearby wall was fortunately broken down at the confluence of the two canyons. Bobby Ray could have scrambled up in minutes, but he had to go slow and practically drag Rio to the top of the plateau. They kept the canyon close by so they could see into the bottom, both to make sure there was nothing moving down there and to see if it was possible to transport Polar to the seep. They reached the edge of the plateau directly across from the sick camp just before sunset. Signaling to the others that their mission had been successful, they started down into the ravine. Near the bottom, as Ijen was descending to help them carry the canteens, she suddenly screamed and put her hand over her mouth. Silhouetted on the plateau above them, against the ruddy sky, was a massive, hulking form, pacing from side to side as only a hungry animal would. A low wail began to rise again, sending a shiver response down Bobby Ray's back. They couldn't see what it was, but it slowly rose on its hind legs, lifting its arms as if in attack position. "It's huge," Nevrio whispered in fright. As the wail rose to that distinctive, soul-shrinking shriek, Bobby Ray could only agree. "Maybe that's why we haven't found Starsa." "Don't say that," Nevrio quickly denied. Ijen joined them in the bottom, panting in fear as she stared up at the plateau where they had been not long before. All three cadets scrambled up the opposite wall as fast as they could to the sick camp. They weren't sure if the silhouette could reach them before they made it to their ledge, and they didn't know how many companions it might have. "What else could have happened to her?" Bobby Ray asked Rio on their way up. "She's either lying at the bottom of one of these canyons, like Polar, or," he drawled, nodding toward the disappearing silhouette. "We better make sure the same thing doesn't happen to us." They reached the camp, where Reeves was using a scope to see across the ridge. As the last light was fading from the sky, Bobby Ray seized the scope from Reeves, focusing on the lurking silhouette. It took a moment for the image to clearly resolve, and then he couldn't believe his eyes. "It looks like him," Reeves said ominously, pulling away from Bobby Ray. "Like who?" Nevrio asked, not understanding. Bobby Ray lowered the scope, feeling dazed. "It's another Rex." Starsa couldn't go very far, with the stasis restraint locked around her ankle, keeping her within a couple of meters of the Rex. He never paid much attention to her, seemingly content with having her nearby as they hiked over the rough desert and started climbing down into one of the ever-present canyons. She had tried talking to this Rex, as well as the other Rex, who regularly appeared and disappeared as they descended to the bottom. But without universal translators, they couldn't understand her. She could understand a few words of what they were saying, but the problem was they didn't speak very much. Mostly, they seemed to communicate through body movements and subtle posturing that she couldn't begin to understand. She had been captured remarkably easily, giving herself up before she realized the Rex had hostile intent. Her first night had been spent alone, curled up between several boulders on the edge of the largest plateau, wondering where Bobby Ray Jefferson and Nev Rio could have possibly disappeared to. When she woke in the morning, the Rex was leaning over her, and at first she had smiled in greeting, saying, "Bobby Ray, I'm so glad you found me." But it wasn't Bobby Ray, and the Rex had clamped one sharp clawed hand around her ankle, locking on the stasis restraint before she knew what was happening. Once they reached the bottom of the canyon, the Rex took her to a space shuttle that was stashed out of sight in the bottom of the canyon. He locked the stasis restraint to one of the bunks while he and his partner went exploring. Starsa could hear the wails and cries of the other Rex over the comm, and with the words her universal translator could understand, it sounded as if the other Rex shuttles had drawn off the Starfleet cadet ship. She wasn't sure if they had attacked the ship, but from the viciousness of their language, she wouldn't have been surprised. One thing she knew, these Rex weren't anything like Bobby Ray. They looked alike, tall, broad-shouldered, with blondish orange fur, but these Rex wore their hair longer, teased up in decorative tufts. Their teeth also seemed bigger, and their claws were much longer, sharpened to a microfine point. At first, they went out and explored the terrain together, and she could see them through the view portal at the front end of the shuttle, curved and offering a nearly 300-degree view around the sides of the shuttle. The Rex ventured out in ever-widening circles, starting off and returning to home base, as if extremely cautious about leaving her there. Starsa was mesmerized by the view, but it was also incredibly disorienting. After several hours, she actually had to turn around. It had given her such an ungodly headache. By then, the Rex had begun to split up and disappear for longer periods of time. Starsa absurdly wished one of them would stay. She hated being alone. Her one night on the rocks had been the longest amount of time she had ever been completely by herself. On Opalasa, her homeworld, no one was ever alone. She came from one of the most crowded environments in the galaxy, averaging almost 100,000 people per square mile on the islands that were scattered throughout the shallow seas. But her people had been living under those conditions for 7 centuries. She missed having her extended family just beyond the walls around her, but the Academy quads were so similar that her heart, as well as her body, had soon gotten over her first fierce bout of homesickness. But now she was forced to stay alone in the darkened shuttle, shackled to the bunk. She couldn't reach her bag with her gear to try to short out the stasis, and she couldn't get anywhere near the control panels of the shuttle. The interior of the shuttle was so confusing that even if she did get loose, she wasn't sure she would be able to fly the ship. And that was saying a lot. Prior to this experience, Starsa would have said she could pilot anything that was capable of becoming airborne. But this ship was different. The dark gray bulkheads bulged outward, and there seemed to be control units and readout screens on the walls and ceiling, as well as the floor. All Starsa could do was wait, biting her nails at her inactivity, wondering if the Rex would ever return for her. She drank the last of the water from her canteen, and her stomach was trying to twist out of her body in its demands for food. She wished she had eaten more last night before the Rex took away her bag, but she remembered Nevrio's caution just before they beamed down that they would have to conserve their supplies. And she started to wonder if something had happened to the Rex. Maybe she was stranded. She knew better than to panic, certain that the cadet ship would not be kept long from the planet. Someone would arrive to save them. She just needed to hold on. But her fear of being by herself, of hearing nothing but her own heartbeat, was beginning to drive her crazy. She tried singing to herself, but she had a terrible sense of rhythm, and her attempts offended her own ears. Long after it had gotten dark, both Rex returned about the same time. Starsa could see them through the front portal as they approached and softly bumped heads in greeting, a quick rub before twisting away. When the door opened, she could hear their slow, chirruping noises. Mainly it sounded like queries, questioning each other about what they'd seen, what to do about it. They both grew agitated, their tails abruptly slashing back and forth as one or the other would snarl or reach out with a sharp swipe. They kept mentioning Rex. That was one word familiar to Starsa because Bobby Ray often dropped his native name into conversations. Women seemed to love the rumbling murmur, and Starsa had sometimes teased Bobby Ray by mocking him with the sound in front of another one of his girlfriends. Now Starsa thought she would try it out for real. Rumroa, she murmured in a low voice, trying to catch that precise rise at the end that gave the Rex name such a lilting, enchanting flair. The two Rex stopped short, looking at Starsa with almost comical surprise. She laughed out loud, unable to stop herself. Then they looked annoyed. "No, I'm sorry," she tried to tell them. But she couldn't help giggling again at their affronted expressions. They looked exactly like Bobby Ray that time she put double-stick tape on his sleep cushions. The slightly smaller Rex let out a short, sharp note, very high, while the other gave a plaintive high to low tone, much lower pitched. Starsa's translator beeped and gave a literal interpretation. "Indignation. Protest." "All right," Starsa told them, raising both her hands. "I said I'm sorry." Grudgingly, the Rex gave her a twisted piece of some kind of dried flesh that she had to gnaw on. They also gave her water, which she was properly grateful for. She banged the dried meat against her bunk a few times before dunking it in the remains of the water to soften it. She hoped they would get the message, but the Rex were concentrating on their shuttle controls. Soon after that, a thrumming sound began to vibrate the bulkheads, and she understood why her bunk was padded both below her and along the curved bulkhead. As the ship lifted off the ground, she felt a subtle pull toward the hull. She realized the gravity generators were situated so the hull was down from every direction. The Rex moved easily around the interior, using the controls on all four of the curved walls, resting casually on the small bare platforms and protruding benches. Suddenly, the engineering puzzle became clear, and Starsa understood how the Rex could pilot their strange craft. They leaped from one control to the other, defying the gravity to twist and turn in the air, landing exactly where they intended. It was so effortless that it looked like a beautiful dance. The shuttle lifted out of the canyon, rotating as it cleared the top of the plateau. Starsa felt her stomach heave against the lazy turn, jostling the food and water she had eaten too fast. At first she swallowed, maintaining control, but when the ship seemed to fail sideways out from under her, while her eyes told her they were flying straight up, she let out an unattractive burp. Both Rex swiveled their heads around to gape at her. Starsa held onto her stomach, her eyes bulging expressively as she hung on. The Rex showed, by every stiff motion, that they knew what was happening. Their ears were twitching rapidly back and forth as they gently slowed the motion of the shuttle, giving Starsa's body time to adjust. They seemed annoyed at having to move at a crawl, but Starsa thought that it served them right after leaving her alone all day. Defiantly, she took another bite of her meat stick. Maybe if she disgusted them enough, they would toss her back where they found her. As the shuttle began to descend, she thought her idiotic plan might actually be working. But the wicked glare in the Rex's eye as he leaped toward her told her otherwise. Then he touched a hypospray to her neck, and she dived into blackness, her hand still clenched around the half-gnawed meat stick. At first, Starsa thought she was dreaming. And from the brightness against her eyelids, she realized that time must have passed. She could hardly move at first, and had trouble convincing herself that she had been knocked out all night. It felt like only a second, and she was very groggy, as if she had spent the night walking around and around the shuttle. But according to the deep crease in her arm from the half-eaten meat stick, she'd been lying there like a log for hours. Neither of the Rex were in the shuttle, and moving to the furthest reach of the stasis restraint, she still couldn't see them outside. The shuttle was resting in a different canyon now, aimed toward a sort of oasis along one wall. It was the first truly green vegetation she'd seen on this planet, but then she hadn't had a chance to see much. Her canteen was nearby, so she drank some water to clear her head, then finished off her meal from the night before. When she had drunk as much as she could, she considered what to do with her only tool. Tightening the cap, she took aim and hurled it at the main control panel. The canteen bounced against the plasteel, but there was a reassuring crunching sound from one panel. Unable to reach her canteen for another throw, Starsa spent her time dismantling the supports of the bunk. It was like a compulsive action, peeling the cushions off the base and wall, shredding them as she did. But if she stopped, words and images swirled around in her head as if trying to fill the void. She almost longed to be knocked out again. She had never woken up alone before, and it was deeply unnerving. The silence spoke too loudly, telling her that she wasn't there if no one was able to validate her existence. Life was interconnected. She was nothing, yet she couldn't be nothing, and she had to do something, anything, to prove she was alive. At least the destroyed bunk was a testament to her will. She noticed immediately when one of the wrecks came down the rocky wash at the bottom of the canyon. He dropped down to one knee and perked his ears at some sound. Her only warning was the slight sideways flattening of his ears as the other wrecks leaped out from behind a pile of jagged boulders that had fallen from the wall. Starsa thought they were fighting, but the bigger wrecks rose up on his toes, dodging back before darting in to give the smaller one a few solid bats on the side of the head. The smaller wrecks bared his teeth. Then, with a huge leap, he crossed the gap between them, grabbing onto the big wrecks like a wrestler. They tumbled over the sand and rocks until the smaller one suddenly darted off. The big wrecks let him go, shaking out his fur before opening the door to the shuttle. The chirping he was making sounded like he was laughing. Then he saw the pile of bunk shreds scattered throughout the shuttle. Starsa looked around with him as if she had never seen it before either. Actually, she hadn't realized how much damage she had done, and it looked even worse than it was. The wrecks made high-pitched, sustained noises aimed in her direction. He never stopped scolding her as he gathered up some of the shreds, dismayed by the extent of her work. Starsa had to cover her ears at the incessant, infuriating noises, and she almost didn't realize how much the translator was catching. "Pestering little female! Useless! Get rid of it!" he muttered, giving her a murderous glance. The other wrecks appeared in the doorway, his ears up and alert. Their argument over what to do with her came through loud and clear. After listening to their plaintive whines, she realized how Bobby Ray came by his fastidiousness. Starsa didn't care. At least she wasn't alone anymore. Even better, while one of the wrecks removed her restraint from the bed to his own ankle, Starsa managed to grab the tiny toolkit that was hooked to the flap of her bag. The two wrecks were squabbling so hard that they didn't notice as she slipped the palm-sized kit into her pocket. Before she could congratulate herself, she was jerked along with the wrecks as they left the shuttle. She hated having to run to keep right by his side as she stumbled over rocks that he treated like smooth pavement. Climbing while restrained was even tougher. It took a great deal of time, but she managed to get up the side of the cliff, slipping more than once in what would have been a deadly fall. Every time the stasis restraint caught her ankle and held her dangling until the other wrecks could lift her up so she could grab a hold of the rocks again. She felt like a toy bobbing on a string, and she began to wonder why they were bothering with her at all. She found out when they staked her to the top of the plateau. She had a clear view of the oasis down below. The two wrecks climbed back down, nearly to the floor of the canyon. She thought they were leaving her there, exposing her to die. Her initial flush of indignation seemed absurd in the light of attempted murder. but she was comforted by her kit resting snugly against her ribs. All she needed was a little time with her tools, and she would be free of the restraint. But the wrecks stayed in sight, and she didn't want to risk them catching her before she could trip the locking mechanism. As she fidgeted, she saw what they were watching for. Several cadets came around the bend of the wash, distinctive in their gray coveralls. Even from a height of several hundred meters, Starsa easily recognized Bobby Ray. They were tightly grouped, and a dark-haired cadet was being carried. She could recognize Rio by the way he walked. A hurried rush forward, a pause to check on the hurt cadet, calling forwards the lead cadet who walked in front with a bare knife. Starsa thought she recognized Reeves, one of the guys she grab-boarded with. She waited to get their attention, but they saw her almost at the same time. "Starsa!" Nevrio shouted, running forward as if a cliff didn't rise between them. "Watch out!" Starsa frantically gestured downward, trying to get them to see the wrecks. Bobby Ray, down there!" They couldn't hear her because of the wind whistling through the narrow canyon. She could tell because they carefully set down the hurt cadet while Bobby Ray loped up the side canyon, heading toward the lowest part of the wall to help her. She kept shouting, but it was no use. She could feel the wind snatch the words from her throat until it was raw. Her panic only made Bobby Ray hurry faster, watching her, trying to figure out what her problem was. Nevrio was not far behind, calling up some kind of encouragement. Bobby Ray was quite close to the wrecks when they emerged from the shadows of the rocks. One was on each side of him, moving in slowly. The other two cadets below jostled in panic, dragging the injured cadet in the opposite direction. Bobby Ray backed down the slope as fast as he could, catching up to Rio, who was also trying to get away from the big wrecks as they slowly closed the distance between them. Starsa shielded her eyes against the blazing sunlight that glared off the polished white rocks at the top of the mesa. The wrecks had used her as bait to lure the cadets in, making it easy to ambush them. Starsa leaned over the edge, straining against the restraint, trying to see as her teammates disappeared into the bottom of the canyon. They had used her as bait. Grimly determined to make her escape, she pulled her kit from her coverall. Give her 3 minutes, and she would be free. Bobby Ray ran past Nevrio as they reached the canyon floor. It was like one of his childhood nightmares, being chased by a wild animal. Ijen and Reeves had dragged Polar into the niche that contained the water seep. They were standing among the pygmy trees, holding their knives out. I'll draw them off," Bobby Ray called out, hoping the wrecks wouldn't stay and make mincemeat out of them. He needn't have worried. Glancing back, he saw that the wrecks loped past the other cadets as if they didn't exist. He also noticed that Rio was right behind him, moving remarkably fast for a guy who couldn't seem to walk without stumbling over his own feet. Bobby Ray picked up speed, wishing Rio had veered off to help Ijen and Reeves. "No, stop!" Rio called out, but he was running as hard as he could, too, with the wrecks right behind him. Bobby Ray wasn't sure what Rio was yelling about until he rounded a curve and came to a dead end in the canyon. He began scrambling up the steep sandstone side, honeycombed by weather. Some of the holes were a couple of feet across, others were a few meters or larger. Nevrio fell further behind as Bobby Ray reached a large hole. His whiskers quivered, sensing the eddies of the wind hitting the rear wall. The cliff grew steeper, so he quickly made a tactical decision to make it stand there. Nevrio was panting as he neared the lip of the shallow cave. Bobby Ray reached down and grabbed his hand, hauling him inside. They could hear the low-pitched growling, a curious, sustained noise. The two wrecks were just below, making that sound from the back of their throats. Their tails rhythmically lashed back and forth as they crouched and glared at Bobby Ray. His own ears were flattened against his head in a way he'd rarely felt before. He let out a half-hearted squawk in response, a clear signal of his panic. "What do we do?" Nevrio asked. "How should I know?" Bobby Ray countered. "They're your people. Humans are my people," the Rex contradicted. The two Rex climbed into their shallow cave, poised on the lip as if assessing the cadets. "Maybe you should try to copy them," Nevrio suggested helpfully. "Use your tail." "What do you mean, use it?" "Swish it back and forth like they're doing." Bobby Ray glanced doubtfully back at his tail and gave it a few experimental twitches, moving forward as he did. "That doesn't feel right, somehow." Before he could finish his sentence, the two Rex rushed the cadets, snarling and spitting, their tails furiously lashing back and forth. Bobby Ray and Nevrio scrambled deeper into their cave, brandishing their knives more out of fear than bravado. Snarling, the two Rex faced them until it was clear they could no longer back up and that they weren't about to advance. And the Rex slowly began to retreat, making odd chirping noises, as if they were laughing, as if they were leaving simply to prolong the hunt. Bobby Ray could tell by their upright ears that they knew they could attack the two cadets at that very moment and rip them into shreds with their 4-inch claws. "I didn't know they could grow that long," Bobby Ray said in a hushed voice after the two Rex had withdrawn back down into the canyon. Nevrio eyed the inch-long, rounded nubs that were instinctively splayed from the tip of each of Bobby Ray's fingers. "Maybe you should sharpen them up a little." "Yeah, like your tail suggestion was such a great idea?" Bobby Ray snarled. "When I want your advice, I'll ask for it." Rio backed up, holding up his hands. "I know you're better suited to handle this than me." Wearily, Bobby Ray sat down and leaned his forehead against the wall of their niche. "Problem is, I don't know what to do." Starsa grabbed Ijan's pack after descending the cliff to the seep. When she saw the direction they had run, she used the ropes that had been left hanging by the seep to climb to the top of the plateau. Tracking the cadets through a side canyon, she saw the Rex pacing in the bottom. They were focused on a hole in the cliff wall, waiting for the cadets to come out of hiding. Starsa ran around the deep cut in the plateau to the edge just above Bobby Ray and Rio. She tied one end of the rope around several boulders. Crouching down to stay out of the range of the Rex's keen eyesight, she neared the edge to judge the right spot to lower the rope. The bigger Rex abruptly stopped in his tracks, raising his head slightly and drawing back his upper lip. She could see his tongue flicking the roof of his half-open mouth. The Rex seemed to be almost in a trance-like state for a few moments, holding its breath and staring straight ahead. Then it abruptly shook its head and looked directly at her. Starsa wasn't about to get into a staring match with the Rex. She never won with Bobby Ray, always ending up blinking first or turning away from his huge, unwavering gold eyes. She dropped the rope. "Bobby Ray, Nevrio, grab the rope!" Bobby Ray leaned out of the hole in the wall, giving her a wide-eyed stare. "Hurry!" she shouted at him. As Bobby Ray began to claw his way up the cliff, leaving deep grooves in the wall from his hind claws, the other two Rex retreated to a place where they could get up the cliff. Starsa chewed on her lip, waiting their fast progress. "They want you," she told Bobby Ray. "How reassuring," he retorted, nervously watching as the Rex bounded gracefully up the steep slope. "Help me!" Nevrio wailed from below, dangling from the rope like he'd run out of strength. With Bobby Ray's assistance, Starsa pulled Nevrio up at least a body length, looping the rope around the boulders to give them leverage. They gave another mighty heave, bringing the Bajoran near the lip of the plateau. "Uh-oh," Bobby Ray exclaimed as the Rex reached the plateau and headed for them. "You're talking to them wrong," Starsa panted. "They haven't given me a chance to talk to them," Bobby Ray protested. "They talk with their bodies, not their mouths. Go meet them," Starsa told him, hanging onto the rope with all her might. "Rio, You'll have to climb up the last bit. Hesitantly, Bobby Ray moved forward to meet them. Not like that, Starsa explained. Make yourself look bigger. Fluff everything out. I'm going to get killed, Bobby Ray muttered. Think of it as stylized combat. I doubt they'll really want to hurt you. They would have killed me. They're confused because you're not responding right. She grunted, holding onto the rope. Rio, get your Bajoran butt up here. A 3-year-old could climb faster than you. Bobby Ray faced the two large wrecks as they cautiously approached, no longer growling as they had when he had run. He realized he was on the balls of his feet, and his shoulders instinctively squared to make as himself appear as big as possible. Another editing problem. They began to circle, and he kept his face toward them, backpedaling slightly to keep them from surrounding him. The smaller wrecks fell back, letting the larger one move in. All Bobby Ray could see were the enormous incisors of the wrecks in each one of those 4-inch claws. The hair on his spine crawled as if sensing the way those jaws would clamp on the back of his neck to deliver the killing bite. Make the first move, Starsa hissed from behind him. Bobby Ray gave her a quick glare. Why hadn't his parents ever taught him about wrecks? Surely they knew that going into Starfleet he was bound to encounter his own kind. If he got out of this, he was going to have a long talk with his mother. Go on, Starsa urged. Be tough. Put your ears back, like when you're challenging someone to a fight. You're interfering with my concentration, Bobby Ray snapped. The wreck stopped, seemingly confused, looking from him to Starsa. Bobby Ray realized she was right, and he began advancing slowly, weaving from side to side, taking care to rotate his ears so the backs faced frontward, and what Starsa said was his growly look. It seemed to work, because the other wrecks immediately flattened his ears, not just turning them back, but making them almost disappear. Bobby Ray tried out a low growl or two, but was less than pleased when a spine-chilling wail seemed to rise from nowhere. What's that? Nevrio asked, peeking over the edge of the plateau. I think it's coming from him, Bobby Ray said out of the corner of his mouth. This time he was careful not to break his stance. Knowing he could never compete with that unearthly sound, Bobby made a big show of moving forward a few inches, his legs absurdly stiff. That's good, Starsa called out encouragement. I think you're scaring him. Is that a good idea? Bobby Ray murmured, advancing, then pausing, giving the Rex plenty of time to call it quits. As the Rex came very near, his head seemed to twist as if focusing in on Bobby Ray from a different angle. He took a slow step forward and twisted his head the other way, and Bobby Ray started to get the feeling that he was a sitting duck. A rather realistic growling whine rose from the back of his throat, rumbling out and rising in power as adrenaline-laced panic sang through his nerves. They both slowed, moving in tiny increments, balanced only by each other's shifting. The Rex was screaming directly at him, frozen, and Bobby Ray felt the same compulsion to glare at his rival, to move even slower, as if not to admit fear. Suddenly, his adversary lunged toward him, and Bobby Ray shied back, trying to get room to maneuver. The Rex came in over his back to get his teeth on Bobby Ray's neck. The cadet kicked out his leg, swiping support from under the Rex, causing both of them to tumble away from each other. Bobby Ray was quickly back on his feet, twitching his fur, trying to feel if he'd been slashed by those deadly claws, but the Rex hadn't connected. Bobby Ray silently blessed every hand-to-hand defense instructor he'd ever had. The Rex seemed even more wary this time, but he stared hard at him before coming in again, taking a defensive posture. When Bobby Ray immediately countered his stance, the Rex didn't move in as close this time. After a few frozen moments, wailing and rumbling loud enough to make Starsa cover her ears, the Rex finally began to ease back. Bobby Ray felt himself relax with every centimeter the Rex slowly retreated. It was so gradual that he wasn't sure it was over until both the Rex faded away, turning and disappearing down into the canyon. You did it! Starsa exclaimed, clapping her hands. She jumped on Bobby Ray, wrapping her arms around his neck. He was practically rigid, still in his alert stance, feeling strangely exhilarated and unwilling to break his pose. "Let go," he ordered under his breath. Laughing, Starsa jumped down and did a little dance. "We did it! We did it!" "They might come back any second," Nevrio said, edging up to them. Bobby Ray noticed. He stayed well out of arm's reach. "No, they won't," both Bobby Ray and Starsa said at the same time. She grinned, and he finally felt his whiskers move in response, lying smoothly against his face as his teeth showed in a smile. They didn't even make it back to the seep to rejoin Ijin, Puller, and Reeves before the cadet ship signaled them to await transport. As the stark landscape faded from view, Bobby Ray knew it would be forever burned into his memory, along with the victory he'd had facing down the wrecks. There were no fatalities among the cadets, the survival instructor informed them on reaching the ship. Everyone has automatically passed their survival test, whether they regrouped or not. Bobby Ray had completely forgotten about the academy, and it seemed very far away with the battle lust still thrumming through his blood. "When we realized it was a ruse," the instructor added, "we fought our way back through the wrecked shuttles that were holding us off. We believe they were drawn here because of your life signs, Cadet Jefferson. We could tell there was a confrontation going on down there. What happened?" Bobby Ray shrugged one shoulder. "It was some sort of mock battle. As soon as I engaged them, they withdrew." He knew that didn't explain everything, but he also knew there was no way to talk about what had happened. It was more subtle and more powerful than anything he had ever felt before. He was used to always being the strongest, the fastest, the most agile. But when his own kind had challenged him, he felt as bumbling and awkward as never. He had gone into security because it came naturally and was easy for him, but after seeing the wrecks laughing at him while he was stuck in that hole, he realized how much he had let his natural abilities slide. Now he couldn't wait to get back to the academy and try some of those intimidation techniques used by the wrecks. Just wait until his instructors saw what he could do.